Hey guys, it's Fee here from Quilt Kits. I'm going to talk to you today about your binding strips. So if you bought a complete kit from us, it will have binding strips included. They are 2 inches wide. If you have a throw kit, there'll be 6 pieces in there. And if you have a small kit, there'll be 4 pieces in there. So the first thing that you're going to need to do if you have the throw size kit is you'll need to join 2 pieces together to make a strip that's long enough to go along the long side of your quilt, and you'll need to do that twice so that you end up with 4 pieces, 2 short pieces and 2 long pieces. If you're planning to do the mitered continuous binding strip option, this also applies to that. So I'm just going to show you how to do it. As they are 2 inches wide, what you're going to do is you're going to put one strip over the other, face sides together, and you're going to have a little overhang of the seam allowance, so a 1/4 inch overhang on both edges. And what you're going to do is rule a line on your binding strip, which I've already done, from corner to corner, a diagonal line, making sure that you have your seam allowance on both edges. What I always like to do before I sew anything to do with this diagonal binding situation is I like to pin it first to make sure that actually it's facing the right way and that my line is in the correct place. So I'm just going to pin that and turn it back over, and what you should see is that these edges will line up perfectly. So I'm going to go ahead and sew on that line, and that's how easy it is to make a join in your binding strip. Regardless of whether it's a straight cut or a bias cut, you join your binding strips in the same way. It's super simple. Okay guys, I finished quilting my quilt, so now I'm going to work on adding the binding. So I've gone ahead and I've trimmed off the wadding and backing fabric on my quilt to be 1/2 inch from the edge of the fabric. And how that works out is I'm going to have our 2 inch binding strip, which we're going to sew on face down along the 1/4 inch seam allowance onto our quilt top. And then what we're going to do is we're going to fold that over and we're going to hand sew it onto the back. The reason that we're trimming this to 1/2 inch from the edge is obviously to allow for our seam, a 1/4 inch seam allowances on both sides, and there's a little bit of fat in there. I've actually trimmed mine a little bit less than 1/2 inch because I like my binding to be a bit thinner. My best tip is to get your binding strip and actually pre-press 1/4 inch fold along the edge. This is going to be my piece that goes on here. I'm going to go and sew it on in a minute and I'll come back and show you. And after I've sewn it on, I'm going to press this up. Once I press that up, I'm going to turn it over and I'm going to be clipping this on to sew onto the back. So I find it way easier if I've pre-pressed this little 1/4 inch over, so that it's way quicker and it's neater than trying to iron it once it's connected to the quilt top. So I'm going to remove my basting tape, my basting stitch, and I'm going to go along here and I'm going to sew my binding strip on, and I'm going to do the top and the bottom first, and then I'm going to come back and show you, and then I'll do the long sides and show you how to finish the corners. Okay, I've gone ahead and sewn on my binding strip, and as you can see, once it's on there, it should be sitting around 3/4 inch away from the edge. which is this line here, which it is. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go to the ironing board and we're going to press this away from the quilt top and actually fold it over and clip it. So I've already done that to the other edge, so I'm just going to just flip this around. So that you can see how it looks. So this is how it looks on the front, and on the back you can see that my previously pressed seam will meet up with the stitching on the back. When I first learned quilting, actually, I was taught to, when you hand sew the back, the binding on the back with a whip stitch, is to stitch it into that stitching. I don't do that anymore. I stitch it actually into the backing fabric and the binding fabric. I think that's got a better hold, but you're aiming to line that up. So you can see there the edge of my finished quilting. It's well contained within the binding. So we would hand sew this along the back with a simple whip stitch, which I'll come back and show you. So now that I've done the top and the bottom, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sew the long sides on to my quilt, the long sides binding on, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sew it over the edge of this piece so it hangs over a little bit, and then I'll come back and show you how we're going to handle the corners. Okay, so I've now gone ahead and sewn on the binding on the long side of my quilt, and as mentioned, I've sewn over the top of the binding strip that we already connected onto the short side of the quilt. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to cut this piece off. I'm going to trim it off to the same size as your backing and binding, and I'm going to go over to the iron and I'm going to iron my binding strip over. Okay, so I've ironed my binding strip back, and I've also trimmed off this piece to around the same width as the binding strip. And in order to finish that off nice and square, I'm actually going to fold it in and then fold my binding over exactly how we did before, but now I've encapsulated that corner into this fold. So I'm just going to put a pin in there. What I'm going to do later, when I hand stitch the back of the binding on, I'm going to run a stitch up and down that little corner to hold that piece together. And there you can see it makes a beautiful square edge to your quilt, inside and outside, and it's super easy for a beginner to finish off your quilt this way without having to worry about the miter. The miter isn't that difficult, the continuous binding miter, it's just a bit trickier, and I think if this is your first quilt or first couple of quilts, this is a great way to finish it off. There's lots of videos showing the mitered corner process that you can see on YouTube. I haven't made one, but there's ones where people do it on the sewing machine that are brilliant to watch. But my recommendation is, if you're a beginner, is to give this a try and just finish it off. Make sure you're using thread that's the same color as your binding, and you won't be able to even see it once you've sewn that down. So good luck with that, guys.